So a couple of days ago, I was on a live stream with Dave from Computing Forever, and Sargon of Akkad dropped by, and the conversation took an interesting turn. Now, I'll do my best to accurately represent Sargon's view here, but I suggest you go over to the original live stream and have a listen. The link is in the description below, and I've put in the exact time where the conversation takes the turn I'm about to talk about. Sargon was talking about his, at that time, yet to be released This Week in Stupid, and he made the observation that a certain communist, collectivist, political activism was on the rise, in particular with reference to the British Labour Party under the leadership of, in Sargon's words, the Trotskyite Jeremy Corbyn. Sargon was of the opinion that there's a segment of the middle class that are mindlessly repeating this kind of far-left rhetoric of Corbyn and others, without any historical understanding of these ideas and without any regard to the implications of their outcomes on today's society. And furthermore, that it is imperative for sane people to try and stop this encroaching collectivist movement before it tears down the system. But here's the kicker. Part of Sargon's solution is to give them some of what they want. Now, while I largely agree with this diagnosis of the dangers of far-left political activism, where I radically depart from Sargon is on what to do about it. Sargon was somewhat sympathetic to some of the discontent on the left with reference to the hollowing out of the middle class and the lack of opportunities for those at the bottom of society, and that the concentration of wealth at the top of society was not trickling down to the rest. He then proposed a form of wealth redistribution within large corporations by restricting CEO pay to a multiple of the lowest paid worker in the company, and the excess between what the CEO was previously paid and what he's paid now could be redistributed to put more money in the pockets of those lowest paid employees. So if you believe, like me, in the power of free markets and reaping the benefits of your own hard work and ingenuity, this type of redistribution policy sets off all kinds of alarm bells. But what I want to do here is crunch the numbers using a couple of real-life examples. So firstly, let's take a look at McDonald's. According to payscale.com, the lowest paid McDonald's employee in the US would earn approximately $15,000 a year. Now, the CEO, Steve Easterbrook, has a total remuneration package of $3.6 million. So, if we say, as Sargon proposed, that the CEO be paid 25 times the lowest paid employee, that would mean Steve Easterbrook's salary would be approximately $375,000, and the excess of $3.2 million could be divided up amongst the rest of the employees. So how many employees does McDonald's have worldwide? The answer, 1.9 million. So you can see a little problem. We've got $3.2 million to be divided up between 1.9 million employees, and so everybody gets a grand total of $1.68. Now, of course, we could exclude all the senior management and executives. We could exclude everybody that earns over $50,000 or whatever the equivalent is in other countries where McDonald's operates. And you're still only putting something like $3 extra in the pockets of your lowest paid employees. A completely pointless exercise. Now, of course, McDonald's is a very labor-intensive company that requires lots of employees. So how about a different type of corporation that's less labor-intensive and more about intellectual capital, like Apple? The lowest paid employee I could find was a Genius Bar employee, earning about $29,000 a year. CEO Tim Cook earned a total remuneration package of $10.3 million in 2015. So again, performing the calculation based on the lowest paid employee at Apple, Tim Cook's salary would be reduced to approximately $725,000, leaving approximately $9.6 million to be divided up between the 66,000 employees at Apple, which comes out to about $145 each. But again, let's just divide the money up between the 30,000 retail employees in Apple stores. That comes out to $319, about a 1% increase on the lowest Genius Bar salary. So I hope this demonstrates this is an utterly fruitless exercise, and that any country that decided to adopt such a policy would see a mass exodus of top CEO and senior executive talent. Not to mention that this policy wouldn't affect most employees. In the US, for example, more than a quarter of US businesses have fewer than 20 employees, 42% have less than 50, and 77% have less than 500 employees. There's no way the vast majority of small business owners are taking home more than 25 times their lowest paid employee, and the same could be said for many medium-sized businesses. Now, I also wanted to address some comments made by Sargon in support of his desire to redistribute some of the wealth and income from the top of society to the less fortunate. Sargon made comments to the effect that the middle class is, quote, fucked, and that people at the bottom of society have little or no opportunities to climb the ladder of opportunity. And he made various generalizations, such as decades of stagnating wages for the middle and lower classes. Now, here's the problem with these type of arguments. The poor people of today are not the poor of 10, 20, or 30 years ago. There is such a thing as social mobility. That is, that people in the lower classes can and frequently do escape the lower class and join the middle class, and that people at the top often come tumbling down. There is often confusion between comparing statistical categories, such as the bottom 20% versus the top 20%, as opposed to tracking real flesh and blood humans over time. So I'm going to use here Thomas Sowell's Intellectuals and Society as a source. Quote, in terms of statistical categories, it is indeed true that both the amount of income and the proportion of all income received by those in the top 20% bracket have risen over the years, widening the gap between the top and bottom quintiles. But US Treasury Department data following specific individuals over time from their tax returns to the Internal Revenue Service show that in terms of people, the incomes of those particular taxpayers who were in the bottom 20% of income in 1996 rose 91% by 2005, while the incomes of those particular taxpayers who were in the top 20% in 1996 rose by only 10% by 2005. And the incomes of those in the top 5% and top 1% actually declined. And how about those greedy hoarders at the top? Well, out of the top 400 income earners for each of the 22 years between 1992 and 2013, 72% of them only appear in the top 400 for one of those years. Why? Because people at the top often lose money. They go broke. They lose it in the stock market. Consider that for those in the top 0.1% in 1996, a decade later in 2005, which covers the tech boom and bust, their incomes actually fell 50%. Furthermore, quote, similar to that in the Internal Revenue Service data, more than 3/4 of those working Americans whose incomes were in the bottom 20% in 1975 were also in the top 40% of income earners at some point by 1991. Only 5% of those who were initially in the bottom quintile were still there in 1991, while 29% of those who were initially at the bottom quintile had risen to the top quintile. Now, how about claims of stagnant wages? Well, over the entire period from 1967 to 2005, median real household income, that is, money income adjusted for inflation, rose by 31%. For selected periods within that long span, real household incomes rose even less, and those selected periods have often been cited by the intelligentsia to claim that income and living standards have stagnated. Meanwhile, real per capita income rose by 122% over the same span from 1967 to 2005. So what is the reason for this discrepancy between household income growth rates and individual income? Well, it's pretty simple. The number of person per household has been declining for decades. So, for example, as late as 1970, 21% of American households contained 5 or more people, but by 2007, only 10% did. And how about income inequality? Again, quote, just as household statistics understate the rise in the American standard of living over time, they overstate the degree of income inequality, since lower income households tend to have fewer people than upper income households. While there are 39 million people in households whose incomes are in the bottom 20%, there are 64 million people in households whose incomes are in the top 20%. Even if every person in the entire country received exactly the same income, there would still be a significant disparity between the average incomes received by households containing 64 million people compared to the average income received by households containing 39 million people. That disparity would be even greater if only the incomes of working adults were counted, even if those working adults all had identical incomes. There are more adult heads of household working full-time and year-round in even the top 5% of households than in the bottom 20% of households. So when you hear claims about income inequality, just remember to check whether the data being cited are tracking real flesh and blood individuals or statistical categories. Now, of course, this is not to say that everybody is doing wonderfully well and that the system doesn't need reform. People do struggle. Some people don't make it out of poverty. They find it difficult to climb the ladder of opportunity. But to make broad generalizations about the middle class being screwed and no opportunities for those at the bottom is a gross exaggeration not supported by the data. And more importantly, the idea that we have to give in to the hysterical demands of left-wing nut jobs or else is weak, it's defeatist, and it absolutely must be resisted.